Good morning. Welcome to the last day of Past Virtual Summit 2020. I hope you have had a great week so far, and I hope you're looking forward to the content that you'll have on this last day of the show. My name's Leighton-Dick, and I am presenting this morning on building a security dashboard for SQL Server. A few housekeeping things before we get started. After the show, make sure that you come back to past events if you're not already an active member, and check out everything else past has to offer. Year-round, we provide a lot of great content. We get together in various forms, a lot of it virtually right now, of course, but especially as we start to move out of this, you'll start to see a lot more activity in local events. We have local groups, most of which are working virtually right now. SQL Saturday events all around the world. If you like Summit, you'll love a SQL Saturday. Past Marathon, the virtual groups, which are all topic-based and produce webinars on a frequent basis. And then we also have the new Past Pro memberships, which are honestly pretty great right now and which are only going to get better over time. Please make sure that you submit your session evaluations at the end of each session and the event evaluations at the end of the summit. We're always looking for your feedback. We really want to know what you have to say. Speakers especially thrive on your feedback. We really want to know what you have to say, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because that's really how we get better. So please submit your evaluations. One other note is that the Past to Prizes event is going on. And if you haven't been scanning your QR codes, you need to get that going. But you will have a chance for a bonus QR code at the end of this session. So stay tuned through the end. My name is Leighton-Dick, and I am the president and principal architect at Kingfisher Technologies, a consulting firm over here in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. One of my focuses is on data protection. This is a subject I've worked with for a long time, and I'm really passionate about it, and I'd love to share it with you today. I'm also a Microsoft MVP, and I am a regional mentor for the U.S. Midwest region of PASS. If you have any questions after the session, I'm happy to answer any questions that, in the Q&A afterwards. You can also get a hold of me after the show, either on one of the social media outlets that you see here, or my email address is also going to be posted on one of the last slides in the deck. This is the final session in this year's Security Virtual Pathway. I hope you've enjoyed these sessions. If you have not followed the pathway, please make sure you go back and check out William, John, and Jeff's sessions earlier in the show. Okay, for today's session on building a dashboard, what we're going to talk about is really the soup to nuts version of how would you take the raw data that is within SQL Server's management views and pull that into a central repository, build it out, and create the dashboard that you can use to keep track of your security information on a regular basis. It's a really important topic, very timely right now as we have more and more security breaches, and it becomes more and more of a critical issue. Security obviously has become critical. Everybody that's on this session, I'm sure already knows exactly what a big problem this has become. Not only do we have breaches happening on a daily basis. One statistic I found for the other session I did said that we are having a breach right now every 39 seconds, just on average. The scale is absolutely incredible, and it's only increasing. It's becoming an increasingly large concern in enterprises, partially because of the scope and the severity of the impact of a breach, but also because there are so many regulations anymore that apply to data breaches and apply to the protection and the privacy of your customers' data. All of these new regulations are meaning that you're being audited frequently. You need to be it's difficult to keep track with many of the tools that we have at our disposal. And so we need to come up with some better way to do that. And right now, to make things even worse, we have a ton of tools out there. I believe the average statistic is that we have the average large enterprise has over 65 tools that they're using to try and manage the security in their environment. You end up with massive amounts of raw, unfiltered data, to the extent that there are specialized tools like Splunk and SIEM tools to be able to comb through this massive data. You have to have people that are specialized in these tools just to comb through it and try and make some sense out of it. And most tools that you buy, as far as monitoring tools off the shelf, have alerts that you can configure for pretty much everything, and a lot of those are being sent to email, whether by default or by just the way that we have configured them. The end result is noise, tons and tons of noise. So how do you get through all of this to something that is actually meaningful? We really need a way to simplify and focus and be able to view the security logs, the security information that we have at our disposal a lot more easily. And that's where a dashboard comes in. So the first step in this journey toward a dashboard is actually collecting the data. Now, SQL Server has a very large amount of information available to it. But the thing that you need to identify as a DBA looking to create this dashboard is what is the most critical information that you can grab. Because if you pulled everything out of SQL Server that it has, you'd be in the same position that you are now. A lot of raw unfiltered data, a lot of noise. And that does not help you actually get to see the problems. So the first question you need to ask is, what will actually help you spot a problem, or what will help you spot a trend? You're looking for those key nuggets of information. An IP address that really shouldn't be looking at your network. A pattern of failed logins that is really unusual. What will help you surface those little pieces of information that might otherwise go unnoticed in the massive information that you would have available to you? Secondly, what are you being asked for? Take a look at previous IT audits that have been done in your environment. Take a look at what your managers are asking for, or your security officers. Take a look at what you want to know as far as the information that you're looking for on a regular basis for your security of your information. And keep in mind that this does not have to be what we traditionally call security. If something that's important to you is the number of connections per second, for example, then add that into your database or into your data that you're collecting. If it's important to you to know the amount of space, go ahead and add that in. These are pieces of information that give you a more full picture of what is happening in your environment, and that's really what we're going for. We want to be able to surface the most important information, regardless of what the topic is. So just a few examples with regards to security, and these are relatively obvious examples, but these are the ones that I am putting in to the dashboard that you're going to see here in a little bit. New or changed logins. It's important to stay on top of who is adding what logins to your servers. And this also includes dropped logins. One reason that you might want to know this, not only because you want to know what users are being added to what databases, but also if an attacker actually does manage to get access to your database, one of the first things that many of them do is create a login as a backdoor. Or they'll create a login, they'll use it, and then they'll get rid of it and try and clean up their tracks. If you're tracking that, you'll be able to see when an event like that happens, and it will help you be able to prepare. Privileged role changes. Again, if an attacker actually does manage to get access to your system, one of the first things they're going to do is try and find some sort of a privileged role. And if they don't already have it, they're going to create something. Connection stats. I mentioned this a little bit already, but one thing you might look for is an IP address that doesn't normally show up in your logs. You might look for a trend as far as the number of connections that are happening per second or in a given database. All of these various pieces of information are things that you can use in order to be able to find those abnormalities. Orphaned Windows logins. An orphaned Windows login is a Windows login that you've created on your SQL Server that, for whatever reason, generally because the employee has left, or because the employee has changed their name, for example, in the case of marriage, that no longer exists in Windows with the same name that you have in SQL Server. And those are important to keep clean just from a housekeeping perspective. The last reboot. Not only do we want to know when the last reboot was, just for general purposes, because it is important to be able to maintain our SQL servers. And sometimes they do surprise us and reboot on their own. But also, if an attacker is going to has gotten access via RDP, one way that they can break into your SQL server without having the traditional credentials is by switching it to single user mode, and that requires a reboot. It's just one more way that you can track an event that could lead to compromise. And then certificate statistics. And these are things on your certificates, such as an expiration. It's important to know and to keep track when you are using some sort of encryption, when that certificate is no longer going to be valid. Many people wait until they start getting errors that the certificate has already expired. But it's far, far better to be able to replace that certificate a few days, weeks, or even a month or so ahead of the time that the certificate is ready to expire. You want to have that advanced knowledge so that you can work this into your normal schedule. Something else that you may want to know is, when is the last time that the private key was backed up on that certificate? Has the private key ever been backed up on the certificate? Many organizations don't have that as a part of their routine backup strategy. And if you, for whatever reason, lose that certificate, and you do not have the private key backed up, there is no way to retrieve that data that is locked up by the certificate, and you will lose it. I've unfortunately been in seen that situation at client sites before, and it is really not a fun position to be in. So where do you get all this information? SQL Server has it stored in nooks and crannies all over the place. Two of the most common places to find this sort of information are catalog views and dynamic management objects. There are a number of these that are dedicated just to providing security information. And as I said, there's a number of the regular views also that have information that you may want to be able to track for your dashboard. The error logs, of course. The error logs are a little bit harder to sift through, but there are some things logged there that are hard to find other places. The default trace. This is something that a lot of people aren't all that familiar with. System health session is another one of these. They are both created by default by SQL Server. They were primarily intended for troubleshooting when you call Microsoft for support. However, they are available to you as well for your own troubleshooting. And these are always running in the background. As long as you haven't turned them off, they're already gathering data, and you don't have to do any work to get it. There's some really interesting information in both of these. Default trace is tracking a lot of these security events already. so you don't have to create another trace with with a little bit more overhead in order to be able to capture that. System health, one of my favorite pieces of information in system health are trackers of the CPU activity for not only the entire system, but SQL Server as well. And this can help you keep tabs on the percentage of time on the server that is being dedicated to SQL Server. There's also security information that is being tracked by the system health session, especially in the ring buffers. SQL Audit is a very powerful tool in your tool belt for this sort of thing. You can track many, many different security events through SQL Audit. And unlike a lot of these methods, SQL Audit is somewhat protected as far as being able to store that information off of the server, and it even protects it to some extent from administrators as well. And then custom extended events and custom traces. For the type of information that we're going after for the dashboard, I'm not using extended events and traces today, partially because I wanted information that would regenerate in real time, and that's hard to be able to surface with the type of queries that I'm using for this. But there's a lot of great information in both extended events and traces that you can use for capturing. To collect this information, you've also got a number of tools that you can use. SQL Server Audit, of course, is one of those. SQL Agent jobs, you'll see a couple of those that I'm using. If you're using jobs, you want to make sure that you keep them absolutely as small and lightweight as possible. You want to make sure that you're not adding any overhead to the system. It's very easy for your monitoring to build up a level of activity that starts to degrade the performance. And you really don't want your monitoring to be able to affect the rest of SQL Server. But you can use both small scripts as well as small SSIS packages to help you gather this information. I mentioned extended events already. There's also event notifications. A lot of people haven't used event notifications, but they're really a very powerful tool for this sort of thing because they are running in the background. They're watching for those events that are already happening via extended events, and they will automatically kick off a service broker workflow in order to be able to pull those off and do something with them. And we'll see how that works here in a few minutes. And then you will want a collection database on each server. Again, this goes back to keeping the overhead low and making sure that whatever you're doing to capture this information is getting out of the way as quickly as possible. So let's see this, see how I set this up. Pull up my window here. Okay. So here I have a database called Security Collector. And this is where this is my local database where I'm actually capturing this information. I've got a copy of AdventureWorks on here already. And if I pull it up, I have a PowerShell script. It's a derivative of one created originally by Jonathan Cahias years ago. That's just running queries against AdventureWorks at random intervals in order to be able to simulate a workload on here and get some more information. So we have all of these 6 tables. I talked about these as well earlier, but we're going to track the certificate information. I'm grabbing information on the connections that we've got on the server, the last reboots, login changes, privilege role changes, and orphaned logins. And to gather this, I'm using a few different methods. Pull this procedures here. And by the way, if anybody wants to try this, I don't have the demos up on the site yet, but I will be putting them up there. I'm also going to put this out on my GitHub repository. And I'm going to try and keep this a live project to continue to to evolve this and make it even better. So you'll be able to go out and grab this information and try it in your own environment. So the first thing that I'm illustrating here is how I'm grabbing Windows logins. Basically, I'm just using a very simple procedure here. There is a procedure here built into SQL Server called SP-validate logins. And SP-validate logins looks at your the list of server principals, your logins in your database, and it goes out and checks it against the Active Directory. It's a very simple, very quick check. Just simply looking for anything in your SQL Server that does not exist anymore in Windows. If it finds something, it's going to go ahead and merge it back into the table, and it's going to stamp it with the time that it last noticed that record being missing from the table, or missing from Windows. So if I run this, you will see here, at this point in time, I don't have any orphaned logins, and that's a good thing. So, okay, so then the day since the last reboot, or the last reboot, I talked about why that's an important one. For my security log, I wanted to get everything into UTC, because then that eliminates any bias or any skew based on daylight savings time or any other time zone that you may deal with, if you're a larger organization, especially. There is a in sys.dmossysinfo, there is a column called SQL Server Start Time. That's probably the easiest place to be able to get this. There's other ways to do it as well. And keep in mind that these don't have to be perfectly accurate, especially for something like the last reboot. Another way you can do this is simply with a startup procedure, or with a job that runs on startup. Even if you just grab the time when it restarts, just by grabbing the get date when that job runs on reboot, that will still give you enough information in most cases to be able to track when a reboot is happening and be able to stamp it in your log. So if we show the captured last reboot here, we can see that the last time it rebooted was on the 7th at 9:55. Again, this is UTC. Okay, for certificates, there's a number of DMVs and catalog views for certificates. In my case, I'm going out to each database, and I'm going to grab the information out of my certificate DMV. Not only information on the certificate catalog, the certificate views is useful to me, so I'm going to grab the information that's most relevant for my purposes here. And you'll find this a lot as you're going through these DMOs, or the catalog views, is that there's a lot of information that's really not relevant. So don't just grab everything. Sort through it, reduce the noise, and get it down to the most important information for you, for your purposes. In my case, that's database name, the name of the certificate, the key length, because that might be important when I'm replacing that key, expiry, the encryption type, the last backup. Okay. And we're going to merge that in as well. So if I go out here and I run this, you'll see, and it's probably a little bit small on the screen, but you'll see here that I've got a number of certificates here. These are all regular server-generated certificates. You can tell by the double hash mark in front of them. But I do have my TDE certificate here in master, which expires in 2 years. And so we'll have some information, and I have backed that up. It shows that in my log. Okay. So now I've grabbed my basic procedures, and I want to actually schedule those. So I created, I've got the job code in here, but I've created 3 different jobs. One of these 3 jobs is going to run every night, and it's going to capture the orphaned logins and the certificates. Another job is going to capture the audit information, and we'll talk more about the audits that I'm going to do here in just a minute, but that's going to run, I believe I have that one set to run every 2 minutes. And then I have one to capture the last reboot time, and that's set to run on restart because I really don't need to capture that every day. Okay, and those are very simple. Those are just running the stored procedures that I created. Okay, first group is very simple. The second group is using event notifications. And part of what I wanted to show in these demos is how you can use a variety of different methods to be able to pull this. And some of these tools that we've talked about for years that many people may not have picked up on, but they're really very powerful things that we just need some experience on. Event notifications is one of my favorite things because it is very, very low overhead. And in this case, it's got a lot of built-in features that we can use in order to, that we can take advantage of to be able to capture this security information. So we're going to start out by creating a very small service broker architecture. And you do have to make sure you're enabling the service broker on the databases. And you'll be able to see that in the reset script, or the creation script for these databases. You need to make sure you have a master key for security purposes. There's a couple other requirements for it as well. But then you create a few different objects. You create a queue, you create a service, and then you create a route. And for event notifications, there's a specific contract that you use for that service and queue. And then you can create your event notification. In this case, I wanted to create this event notification at the server level because we're going after logins. In some cases, you may not want to have this at the server level. There may be a piece of information that you have just at each individual database level. And that's fine. Just depends on what you're looking for. I'm going to grab the create login, alter login, and drop login event groups. And then I'm going to send it to that notification service that I created up above. And this piece is saying that it's running in the current database. Then I'm going to do the same thing for a different event notification for adding the server role members. And in this case, I'm going after the privileged role member changes like I talked about, such as adding somebody to sysadmin. Like before, then I created a little procedure to encapsulate the logic for this. This is going to be what runs when an event actually happens. The event notification takes care of actually firing it when one of those events I talked about happens. So when a login is created, for example. It's going to fire something off to put it into this queue that we talked about above. And then I have it set as an activation procedure. And so as soon as it arrives in the queue, it's going to do this receive. It's going to wait up to five seconds for this in case that you wanted to schedule this, but it's going to do a receive of the first record in the queue. It's going to set a save point so it doesn't abort the transaction if something happens and you don't lose that record. Then it's going to insert it into my change log. I'm not doing a merge here because this is always going to be an ongoing record of any changes, so it's not going to be duplicative like the other events. We do have to parse some of this out of the pre-built format for the event notification. So we're grabbing that there using XML parsing. And then I've got some error handling logic in here again, just to make sure that we're not losing any records as the transactions move through our system. We're going to do the same thing for the role changes. And then here's the code that we would use to alter the queue and turn on activation. So we can see this by actually just creating a login. So if I go out here, oops. Okay. So here you can see a little bit of information. These are some that I created as a test earlier. But if I was to create a new one now, just create login test with password equal something. That's why we never type in demos. Okay, command completed successfully. Now if I go out here and rerun that, it should already be in my table. Looks like it hasn't quite made it there yet, or there's a problem. For whatever reason, it's not capturing it at the moment. Must be something off. Okay. Let's just make sure that these are both active. Missing it for some reason. Okay, we'll figure that out later. Anyway, that's how you do the event notifications. I also wanted to show you SQL Audit and how all of that works. Okay, again, this is a little bit more complex configuration, so I'll leave it up to you to go through and take a look at the construction of this later on. But in order to do SQL Server Audit, oops, in the wrong spot. Requires two different pieces. It requires the audit definition, which defines the storage and how that's configured. And then it requires the audit specification itself. And this is what the code for the audit actually looks like. I did put a filter on here, so I got rid of the information about the service accounts. You may want to have more complex filters, but there are limits on how much you can put in there. And then I'm creating the server audit specification. And for this particular audit, I'm tracking the successful logins and the failed logins. I'm also going to create, nope, I take that back. This is just the connections. Okay, so I turn it on with that code. And then again, I need a procedure to capture that information and pull it out. I'm pulling it dynamically. And then this is all the information that's in that audit record. Again, you don't get to choose the columns you put in there because it is fairly straightforward as far as setting it up. It's just set. We're going to get the audit file using that path we grabbed above. We're going to actually link it to a couple of tables in SQL Server in order to be able to get the metadata, because it is coded to some extent. Then we're going to parse this out, grab the information we want out of the XML, and dump it into our table again. I'm also saving this audit bookmark table. And what this is as it is basically a marker for the last record that we imported. And the reason this is important is that the the audit information can build up over time. And you want to make sure that you are not just reading the same records over and over and over and wasting a lot of time. So this chunk of code here will actually grab the, it's intended to grab the last record that you pulled, store that so that it can pick up that at that point next time it runs. Okay, so that's all the information that we're capturing. And if you look here at the connections, let's actually do new query. Top 100 from connections. Grab the top 100 records, which should be fairly active based on that table that I created before. But here you can see we've got a number of records that are coming out of that random workflow workload that I put in there. Okay. All right. So what do we have for questions at the moment?
Okay, I've got a couple of questions here around where are the demo scripts going to be available because people are loving these.
Sorry, David, I can't hear you.
Sorry, headset was way too high. Where are the demo scripts going to be available? Because people are loving this.
That's awesome. I've been tweaking them up to the last minute and just trying to make this as good as I can. So I have not uploaded them to the Summit site yet, but I will try to do that as soon as I can after the session this morning.
Cool.
And I will also put them on my GitHub site, and I'll link that from my website.
Okay.
In the deck.
Cool. Okay. Got another question here. Robert loves the tool that's being used when you're creating the T-SQL that provided all the possible parameters in a dropdown, et cetera. What tool is that added that to SSMS?
That one is actually Redgate SQL Prompt.
Okay, cool.
There's others out there, but that's one that I really like.
Perfect. One final question. Does the validation work with Windows groups? And if so, is it recursive for nested groups?
It does work for Windows groups. As far as whether it's recursive, it's not that complicated of a tool. Really, SPValidate logins just goes out and sees if that object still exists in Windows. So if you have a nested group, it's not going to check that all of the levels of that nested group are still existing, because frankly, if you have a group called sales reps, all it knows is that there's a group called sales reps, and it relies on Windows to know who was in that sales rep group. So it's going to check to see if that group exists, but as far as if a person exists, SQL Server never tracks that to that level.
Okay,
does that make sense?
Cool. Sounds good. And then the other thing with SSMS, can you make the screen just a little bit bigger? Just kind of expand it to fill the screen for me. Awesome.
I will do that.
That'll do it.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. So to start with, we collected all the data. I'm just grabbing the raw data at this point in time, doing as little processing on it as possible just to get it into my tables. The next step is to gather that data. And when I'm talking about gathering, I'm talking about a different process. I'm talking about actually taking those data points that are in these local databases scattered all across your environment. In mine here, it's just a test lab. I've only got a couple servers in there. It's not doing it. I don't have a lot of places in the lab for it to pull information from. But in most cases, you're going to have several servers. You're going to pull all this information into one place to be able to analyze it. Because otherwise, again, you've got lots of different tools and lots of different places. We want to pull that together. We need to be able to also spot trends across servers. So for example, one piece you might want to know is in your dashboard is where across all of my servers is a given login being used. That's one thing you might want to track. Or how many failed logins am I getting across all of my servers? You're looking for these overarching trends. And really the only way to do that is if you're pulling everything together to be able to slice and dice it for analysis. This also, by bringing it all together into a central database, you're also reducing the resource load of the dashboard itself, because now you're not having to have queries going out to each individual server. You're pulling it all together. Dashboard only has to look in one place. It's also a lot less complex to code, frankly. As far as which SQL Server platform to use, this is something I've actually gone around with myself on, because you want this to be something that is somewhat isolated. And the reason is that you're collecting security information. And so obviously you need to protect that. You also want to make sure that it's stored in a place that's away from some of the rest of your servers, because you don't want to affect production. You don't want this information to be accessible to just anybody. So you're going to do take some additional steps. If you have a large environment, you may want to have this be on an internal server. I've also thought about using Azure SQL Database, and we'll talk more about why I chose not to use that in this case in just a minute. But you do have Azure SQL Database. You may have Azure SQL Database Managed Instance available to you. And if so, that could be a choice. You also have Azure SQL in a virtual machine. And of those three, I would actually choose SQL in a virtual machine if you wanted to put it up on Azure. And again, we'll talk about why in just a moment. So after you pull all of this information, all of this raw data, and again, don't do a lot of processing on it at this point. Wait until you get it into that central database. After you gather all of that raw data into your central database, then take the time to summarize it. It does, by pre-calculating some of these metrics that you want to find, you're going to save resources later. Again, you want to reduce the load that dashboard actually takes. It also allows for very consistent use of the data. And what you're looking for here is key metrics. Nobody wants to go out to a dashboard that just sits there and again, just lists all of the thousands of connections that you've had in the last 10 minutes. Nobody wants to go to sift through that information. You want to distill this down to preferably numbers. Figure out what are the key metrics. What are the key pieces of numeric data that you can use to figure out the health of your system. So this might be, one that I put in the dashboard is the percentage of successful logins. The lower the percentage, the more important that it is to pay attention to that. Summations, counts, all of these things are things that are useful as far as being able to very quickly analyze and very easily understand the pieces of information that you are displaying on your dashboard. As I said, you want to make this easy to understand. You want to be able to grasp the story of this. You definitely do want to tell a story. You want to grasp the story of this very, very quickly. Ideally, if you could put this dashboard into a production environment, you want to be able to look at this and spend no more than like 5 minutes looking at this dashboard for, here's the things that I want to know that are going to affect the way that my environment is operating today. Or these are, be able to distill out what happened overnight very, very quickly. Then you can, once you have the pieces of information or the metrics to hone in on, the ones that look like outliers, then you can go to a different tool and actually dig into the metrics. But for the dashboard, keep it very, very straightforward so that it's as quick as possible to be able to get to that information. And then limit yourself. It's tempting, and I've seen a number of people do it, where they just throw number after number after number on the dashboard, and it becomes a lot of clutter. You can have multiple pages on your dashboard if you need to, but in general, I would keep each dashboard to like six different types of metrics or fewer. There's exceptions to this, obviously. If you have a few things like the day since the last reboot, it's just a single number, you might be able to put a few of those on there. But just in general, keep the numbers down so that you reduce that clutter. For tools, one tool that I think is underused that I think is perfect for this type of scenario is honestly Service Broker. For those who aren't familiar, Service Broker is an architecture built into SQL Server. It's used by a lot of SQL components, so it's not going anywhere anytime soon. But it's asynchronous. It's a queuing architecture, and it's actually the underpinnings of event notifications. And so it's going to grab these pieces of information, you put it into a queue, and then from there, it makes its best efforts to get it to its destination as quick as possible. But it's guaranteed to get there at some point in time. So it really makes for a great transport mechanism for this because it reduces the load, especially during a spike condition, on your server. In a production situation, you would also want to encrypt the heck out of this database. Just because, again, this is privileged information we're dealing with. Most people will not need to be able to see the details of all of this. So use transparent data encryption to protect it at rest. Use something like always encrypted or in-column encryption. Use SSL, use Azure Key Vault to store your certificates. Keep it away from prying eyes. And then use dynamic data masking to also, again, to keep that information from being easily viewed by a casual bystander. None of these tools on their own are perfect. We're not necessarily looking for perfect. We're looking to reduce the amount of risk that we have in storing all of this information. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are certain reasons that I wouldn't choose, for my purposes, the way I built this, the way I wanted to build this. I wouldn't choose Azure SQL Database or a managed instance. And the reason for that partially is because neither of those are enabled for Service Broker. Service Broker can't run at all on Azure SQL Database at this point. For managed instances, only works within the managed instance. Neither of these can do Service Broker with a remote instance like you'd have on premises. There's also limitations with always encrypted and the way that you can interact with Power BI, which is what I wanted to use for my dashboard. And so just know, before you design the architecture of what exactly that you're going to, you're going to use to build your dashboard and the infrastructure that supports it, know what the capabilities are of the platforms that you're looking at using. Know what you want to use, and then let that inform the tools that you choose. Okay, so let's look how I built that. And by request, I will make my Management Studio bigger. So in this script, and the script is fairly complex because Service Broker's got a lot of pieces to it. Once you understand it, it's really fairly elegant, but it's got a lot of pieces to it to set up. And so dig through the script a little bit. I'll walk you through the various pieces, but dig through this a little bit after the fact and look to see how this is built if you're interested in using Service Broker. With Service Broker, you have message types, which simply are a label to help the system know what information you are sending in a given packet. So I've got an acknowledgement, and ACK comes from the networking world. And then I've got, for each of those, I've got a message type for each of those 6 information types that I captured in my database we talked about earlier. These are all going to be XML. I've got my contract. I'm just using one contract for everything. And this just defines who can send what type of message. So this can, all of them can go into one contract. The initiator can send the 6 types of messages, and then the acknowledgement can be sent back by the target. You create your queue, what I call the collector queue. And then we create the service to relate the queue and the contract. We're also going to create our route to our dashboard. In this case, the dashboard is called the dashboard service, and it's on the local server. You can also easily put this, and that's another reason for using Service Broker, is you can also easily put this on another server, in which case the address will just be the IP address or the DNS name and the port of the receiving server. And you can even have this be multi-hop if you want to. It's very powerful in that regard. So we're going to start by doing that for the collector database. And then we also have a dashboard database. The dashboard database is the database where I'm gathering all of this information into a central place for the analysis. We're going to get it out of that collector database. In this case, the dashboard for demo purposes is on the same server, but ideally this would be in a remote location somewhere. We're going to create the same set of message types. We're going to create the same contract, and we're going to create a queue for it to receive that information into, and then we're going to create a route. And I do have a few pieces of code here that I'm not using in this case just to keep the demo visible, but that gives you examples of how you would set this up for working remotely. I do not have dialog security implemented in this version of it, again, just for demo purposes. But that is something that you would want to do if you were sending this information between services or between servers. And what dialog security is that's the method of encrypting the actual messages that go back and forth through Service Broker. Okay. So now that we've got the underpinnings set up, now we're going to actually create the procedures to send each message type across the wire. I've got one send procedure for each one of these that opens a conversation on the service and then sends the message information across, and it's already pre-formatted in this XML. So we've got 6 of those, one for each message type. These are the receiving procedures, and again, these are going to be fairly similar to the end of the procedure I use for the event notifications. This is going to take the XML that's received by the gathering server, by the dashboard server, and parse out that XML, put it into our tables. Okay. Scroll down here a little bit. And then here's our receive from collector. This is what is going to put the information actually into those tables. Again, receiving from Service Broker, just like we did for the event notifications. We're going to turn on the activation procedure. And then the way I'm getting information into the pipeline is via triggers. And triggers are one of those mechanisms that people love to hate. But if you create a trigger that is very brief and has the error handling in it, it's also a very useful method of being able to get the information into a pipeline like this. It's a perfect method for being able to, in real time, get information into Service Broker and be able to process it. I am using cursors in here to handle multi-row inserts because a couple of these pieces of information can happen in mass. Again, cursors, if properly protected, are not necessarily bad. They have their use cases, and this is one of them. So here we're just using it for XML raw to get it into the transport mechanism and calling that send procedure. All right, so that's how that works. And I'll let you dig into looking exactly how this is all put together, but that's really the mechanism. We're going to use the trigger, to grab this piece of information. We're going to throw it into the queue on the local side. Service broker is going to handle the transport to get it over to wherever your central database is, your dashboard database, and it's going to unpack it and put it into the table on the remote side. Okay. Any questions at this point?
Yeah, we do have a couple here. Does your audit file read process read the active audit file? The reason they asked is that they compress non-active audit files to save space.
Yes, the way I implemented it, it does read any audit files that are still in the directory. And so if you're compressing and moving off your inactive audit files, obviously those will be available. But I'm going in every 2 minutes and grabbing the information, and I'm using those bookmarks to make sure that I'm only pulling the most recent ones. So the way I implemented this should work with what you're describing.
Perfect. Can the script be easily modified to look for inactive AD logins rather than orphaned logins?
Yes. Well, okay, I take that back. Inactive AD logins. What I'm doing here is just SP validate logins, which does not detect inactive AD logins. It's, again, very simplistic. It just looks to see if the object exists in Active Directory. However, you could do other queries, including like PowerShell. You could use PowerShell to grab some information and throw that into SQL Server, into a collection table. You could, there's also ways that you can do that from within SQL Server using, there's ODBC drivers for Active Directory also. So there's a few methods that you can use to be able to match up and grab those inactive logins.
Perfect. And there's one more question here that I'm going to save for the end, depending on how much time we have, related to special considerations with the service broker itself.
Okay. Perfect.
And that's it.
Okay, so let me get back to that. So now we get down to creating the dashboard. For displaying this data, you really want to make this quick to view and to understand. You need to make sure that, and I can't emphasize that enough, again, keep the number of metrics down, make sure that you're displaying the most important pieces, and tell a story. Anytime you're doing a visualization like this, you want it to tell a story about something. And keep it visual. Don't just have number after number or tables of data. Humans are visual creatures. We all respond better to a picture. We all are able to interpret a picture much more quickly than we are text. So keep it visual, tell a story, make it interesting. There's a number of different types of visualizations, and I will be the first to admit that I am not a visualization or a data science expert, but you have a few different types. You've got things like line graphs and spark lines that are great for showing trends. You've got things like pie charts, reviled as they are, and bar graphs for comparisons. You've got KPIs, which are often displayed as like a traffic light. A KPI is a key performance indicator, and that is just a single number that can tell you something about your data and so on. Power BI is a great tool for this, and if you just use the desktop, it's free. You can also just use it personally for free. The Pro license is only $10 a person, so that's not a big expenditure either. It's a great tool to be able to work with it. If you've got SQL Server Enterprise Edition, you can also download Power BI Report Server, which brings essentially Power BI into an on-premises environment. And if you use Power BI Report Server, that will work with Always Encrypted. So there's, while the Power BI service is not enabled for that yet, Power BI Report Server is. If you want to be able to see information in real time on some of this, such as connections, you can use something like Grafana. I know Microsoft has done a bunch of work with Grafana. And that actually works very well with SQL Server. And that is more, where Power BI relies on refreshes, Grafana is much more of a real-time visualization tool. Okay, so just real quick, because I know I'm getting short on time. One more script here, just to show you what I did for this. The way I decided to do the visualizations is with views, and to be able to simplify those metrics. Remember, I had a whole bunch of columns in a lot of these, especially on like the connections. But really, when I want to tell my story, I want to distill this down as much as possible, and I want to have the processing that is not on the server or not on the report server. Especially if you're taking this up to the cloud, you don't want to have any unnecessary information going because that'll slow things down. So I'm doing some pre-summarization here in the database. So I want, for connections, for example, I want the number of connections attempted. I want the IP address, the instance name, obviously. The percent of those that succeeded. And you can conversely do the percent that failed. And then the hour of the day, because when I was doing my dashboard, I decided that that would be the most useful thing, is to be able to see the hour of the day. And so that's one example. Depending on the type of data, I selected different metrics. So for login changes, I only want, are they adding or are they adding or are they dropping connections? Privilege role changes is similar. And then in here somewhere, the reboot, all I care about is the last reboot date. So if I go over now to my Power BI desktop, and you look at that, you can see how I'm using some of these. And I'll refresh it to get the latest information. And I am, if anybody's wondering, I am using direct query here so that I have the latest information. But you can see here, this is just a card view. I've got my slider up here if I had multiple instances being tracked. But I've got my card view just telling me this is a KPI. It's been 6 days since the last reboot of my server. Very, very simple piece of information. Over here, I've got the login changes by type, drop logins, created logins. Down here is probably the most interesting one. I'm using a bubble graph to show the percentage of successful connections by the IP address. So I've got the hour of the day, I've got the number of connections that were attempted, and then the size of the bubble indicates the number of those that actually were successful. In some cases, I've got a bunch of failed logins in here too. That's exactly what I want to see, especially down here. This little pink one, that's one that is not that's one that I would look for as an outlier. That, okay, why do I have this failed login? I don't normally have anything on the 10 dot address here. That's unusual. I want to go check that one out. Certificate expiration. The system certificates always have retroactive dates, so you probably want to include those, but it was good for this illustration. If I wanted to include a new piece of information in my dashboard, it's really very simple. I just go up here and I create I just click on a chart. It'll drop one in for me. And let's go in here and actually let's make this a bar graph. And let's select a few pieces of information. Let's select the row ID. And the target role name, sysadmin. For the row ID, I want to make sure that this is a count. And there we've got a very simple, and there's not a lot of activity in this, but there's this very simple graph on the number of recent changes to my privileged roles, in this case, sysadmin. And you can obviously do a lot more with this, but it does not have to be difficult. This by itself tells a story, especially if I had more data to show. But it does tell a little bit of a story. And then you can obviously go ahead and do formatting changes. You can move this around and put it where you want. So that just gives you a very, very brief idea of how this, how Power BI works. And I wish I had a few more minutes to be able to show that. But again, I'm going to keep working with this. Okay. Any other questions on the dashboard itself?
Not at this time.
Okay. So there's a number of other things that I could have done here. And this is one of those sessions that I could probably talk for a couple hours at least on this, because it's a fun topic. It was a great session to put together. I mentioned you can do live queries with a more real-time tool like Grafana. One that I wanted to work up that I haven't had time to do yet is to grab metrics from WMI. WMI is Windows Management Instrumentation. That's what generates the perf1 counters under the hood, is WMI. And you can actually use a job in SQL Server to query WMI. The query syntax is not easy to parse through, but it's a very powerful method. You can also use PowerShell to grab those metrics. You can set a system stored procedure like the last reboot one, so that it, instead of running in a job, SQL Server can kick it off itself on reboot. Ideally, I want to have much better indexing for this. I could use column store to reduce the size of the tables, especially for large metric tables. Reduce the storage. Data protection is key. I did not implement a lot of data protection in these tables, again, because it would have made it harder to view it in a demo environment. But I'm going to get it out there in GitHub, where you have masking in there. You're using SSL on your instances. In-column encryption are always encrypted. Tokenization. All of the, or both of those can be used to help reduce the likelihood that sensitive information will be exposed. You just have to be a little bit careful how you implement that in this type of a scenario. Dialog security I already mentioned. Azure Key Vault protects your keys. That's a good thing to use in this case, especially if you're going up to the cloud. And then I talked about the locations, using a virtual machine in Azure perhaps to isolate it, or some other method of just isolating that dashboard database. Staying on top of your security data is absolutely critical, but it's very, very hard to do with many of the tools that we have. There's just not really very many commercial tools out there to track this kind of information, but it's not necessarily that hard to create your own either. Take a look at this, play with it, install the demo. As I said, I'll put it out there for you to look at and to be able to tear through it. The important thing is to identify those key metrics that mean the most to you and would help you best analyze what's going on in your environment and the risks that you face. Create your dashboard. And then the most important part, check it on a regular basis. Make sure you're using it. Any final questions in the last few minutes?
We do. Is there a way to create alerts for those thresholds that show up in the dashboard so you don't have to glance at the dashboard all the time?
Absolutely. And that's actually something I did a session on a couple of years ago. But with those event notifications, you don't have to just shuttle it off in the Service Broker. One very common use of the event notification is to create an email to be able to send out. And you could take the same information and handle it other ways as well. So it's all a matter of once you figured out what information you want to grab, you can do anything you want to with it. For this purpose, I just chose to put it in the dashboard.
Perfect. Can you use a linked server instead of the Service Broker?
You can. Linked servers are a lot more common. Most people know how to use a linked server, and so that's part of the reason that I wanted to use Service Broker. I love Service Broker. It's got a lot, very low overhead. One of the best things about Service Broker is that it is asynchronous. And so you do not risk a transaction failing just because a message can't get from server A to server B. With a linked server, if you were, especially if you're doing it through a trigger, you would run the risk of something failing because of your linked server failing.
Perfect. And then for the last question here, and I saved this one for the last because I know it's going to take a few minutes. Are there any special considerations for Service Broker when dealing with multiple servers? There's a really good question about how to collect and gather these amongst multiple servers.
I actually did a session, I believe it was 3 years ago at Summit. It's either 3 or 4 years ago. It's just dealing with this topic. Because Service Broker is an extremely powerful architecture, it's definitely cross-server. It's actually designed to be cross-server. The way that you get to go cross-server is by using those routes, like I showed you. And then on top of that, you add dialog security to encrypt those. It's basically like turning on SSL. It's very, very, very similar concept to turning on SSL on a website to protect that data while it's in transit. The other really cool thing about Service Broker is that you can actually fire one message off to multiple servers simultaneously if you would have to do that for some reason. So yeah, it is a perfect mechanism to do the cross-server delivery like that. And if you want to talk about that in more detail, because I know we're short on time, if you want to talk about that in more detail, feel free to get a hold of me. I would love to talk to you more about that.
Fantastic. Well, that'll do it.
Awesome. I'll stick around until the very last moment. If anybody has any more questions, there is a little bit of a delay on the session, as you probably heard already, is about up to 90-second delay. So get your question in, and I will, as I said, stick around until the last moment to answer it. But in the meantime, thank you very much for getting up early this morning, or perhaps staying up late, depending on what part of the world you're in, to see this session. I loved putting it together. It was a blast to do. Feel free to get a hold of me on Twitter, over Facebook, LinkedIn, or email. And if you have any other questions about this topic, I'd love to hear what you thought about this, and love to hear what you do with it. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of Past Summit, and stick around, by the way, for the Past Surprises QR code.